The Eternal Drive, Secrets of the Ford T. It all started with the hum of an engine. Not the kind of engine you hear today, smooth, efficient, and barely audible, but the uneven, sputtering growl of something ancient, something mechanical, something alive. Jonathan Reed had always felt a peculiar connection to the past. As an automotive historian in Dearborn, Michigan, he spent his days immersed in the world of gears, pistons, and the roaring industrial age. His life revolved around the stories machines could tell, the innovations they sparked, the people they inspired, the way they shaped the world. Jonathan lived alone in a small craftsman house on Edison Street, just blocks away from the Henry Ford Museum. His home was modest, but stepping inside felt like stepping back in time. The walls were lined with vintage automotive posters, colorful depictions of smiling families standing beside their new Model Ts, or adventurous young men gripping the wheels of early roadsters as they sped down open highways. Shelves groaned under the weight of oil-stained repair manuals, dusty trophies from antique car shows, and tin advertisements for long-defunct gasoline brands. But the centerpiece of his world wasn't on the shelves or the walls. It sat in his garage, a 1911 Ford Model T. The car was more than an artifact to Jonathan. It was an obsession. Every nut, every bolt, every curve of the brass radiator had been lovingly restored to its original condition. The black paint gleamed like liquid obsidian under the garage lights, and the hand-cranked engine roared to life with the same stubborn determination it had possessed more than a century ago. Jonathan often spent his evenings in the garage, running his hands over the smooth curves of the fenders, inhaling the faint metallic scent of oil and gasoline. He would lose himself in the details, marveling at the simplicity of the design. A machine that had once revolutionized the world by making cars affordable for ordinary people. On one particular Thursday evening in late October, Jonathan decided to take the Model T out for a drive. The weather was crisp, the air carrying the faint aroma of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. It was the kind of evening that made the past feel closer, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jonathan pulled the heavy garage door open and stepped back to admire the car in the fading light. It was beautiful, a relic from another age. He climbed into the driver's seat, feeling the familiar roughness of the leather upholstery beneath him. With practiced ease, he adjusted the spark and throttle levers, cranked the engine, and listened as it sputtered to life. The sound was music to his ears. The streets of Dearborn were quiet as he guided the car through the neighborhood. The headlights cast long, flickering beams of light on the pavement, and the wooden wheels creaked faintly as they turned. People stopped to stare as he passed, a rare sight in an era dominated by electric vehicles and self-driving cars. Jonathan smiled and tipped his cap to a small group of kids who had paused their game of basketball to watch the strange, ancient machine rumble by. "What's that?" one of them shouted, their voices carrying faintly over the hum of the engine. "A piece of history," Jonathan murmured to himself, though he doubted they'd hear or care. As he drove out of the residential area and onto the quieter roads at the edge of town, the familiar sense of peace washed over him. This was what he loved, escaping into a simpler time, when driving wasn't about efficiency or speed but about the joy of the journey itself. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became. The houses grew sparser, replaced by open fields and the occasional cluster of trees. The sky darkened, stars beginning to peek through the twilight haze. Jonathan slowed the car as he approached an old wooden bridge spanning a narrow creek. It was a spot he had visited many times before, one of his favorite places to stop and think. The water below shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the sound of the creek was soothing, like a whisper from another time. But tonight, something was different. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't quite explain. The usual night sounds, Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, seemed muted, distant. As Jonathan guided the Model T across the bridge, he noticed a faint shimmer in the air ahead. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the water, perhaps, or the headlights catching mist. But as he drew closer, the shimmer grew brighter, taking on an almost liquid quality. It hung there, suspended in the middle of the road, a perfect circle of swirling light and color. Jonathan's heart began to pound. He slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes fixed on the anomaly. The light shifted and pulsed, casting strange, flickering shadows on the trees that lined the road. "What in the world?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. He pulled the car to a stop just a few feet away from the glowing circle. The air around it seemed to vibrate, and he felt a strange pull in his chest, as if the light were drawing him toward it. Jonathan climbed out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the anomaly. The closer he got, the more surreal it became. The edges of the circle shimmered like heat waves on asphalt, and the colors within it seemed to shift and swirl in patterns his mind couldn't quite comprehend. Instinctively, he reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the edge of the light. The world around him erupted into motion. The circle flared brightly, and a low, resonant hum filled the air. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and the Model T's engine sputtered violently before roaring back to life. Jonathan staggered backward, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. But the world was no longer the same. Jonathan blinked, his vision slowly clearing. He was back in the driver's seat of the Model T, but the road beneath him wasn't asphalt anymore. It was smooth and translucent, glowing faintly with an inner light. The fields and trees that had surrounded him were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of stars and swirling colors. The car's engine hummed steadily, stronger and louder than ever before. Jonathan gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, as he stared in awe at the impossible landscape around him. He had crossed into another world, and there was no turning back. When Jonathan opened his eyes, the world he knew had vanished. The Ford Model T hummed steadily beneath him, its engine sounding stronger and smoother than it ever had before. But the road beneath its wheels was no longer asphalt. It was something else entirely, a shimmering surface of translucent light, stretching endlessly in all directions. Above him, the sky was a swirling kaleidoscope of colors. Nebulous shapes floated and twisted, merging and breaking apart in patterns that defied logic. It wasn't the sky he knew. It wasn't the sky of Earth. The stars were closer, brighter, moving as if alive. Trails of light stretched across the horizon, some fading into the distance, others looping in arcs that seemed to ripple through time itself. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel tightly, his pulse racing. He had no idea how he had gotten here, or where here even was. His hands trembled, his breath shallow, as he tried to process the impossibility of what surrounded him. The road stretched ahead of him, an iridescent ribbon winding through the void. But this wasn't a single road. It was a labyrinth. Countless paths branched off in every direction, intersecting, merging, and diverging in ways that seemed impossible. Some twisted upward into the glowing sky, while others plunged downward, disappearing into the infinite depths below. And then there were the other travelers. Jonathan's eyes widened as he saw them. Vehicles of every kind, moving along the endless network of roads. To his left, a chariot raced by, its wheels glowing with fiery light. A figure dressed in Roman armor gripping the reins of two ghostly horses. To his right, a sleek, futuristic vehicle zoomed past, its body a seamless, metallic curve that gleamed with an otherworldly sheen. Farther ahead, A steam locomotive chugged along a path that seemed to defy gravity, its plume of smoke curling through the swirling sky. And beyond that, something even stranger. A massive ship, its sails glowing with ethereal light, gliding smoothly along a road that arced upward like a spiral staircase. This wasn't just a road. It was a nexus, a place where times, places, and dimensions converged. Jonathan's breath caught as a realization hit him. Could this be a wormhole? A black hole? Some kind of interdimensional space? He had read about theories like this in scientific journals, but to see it, to be in it, was beyond comprehension. He pressed the throttle, the Model T surging forward with a surprising smoothness. The car handled better than it ever had before, as if it were made for this strange, otherworldly road. As he drove, he noticed something strange. The translucent road beneath him wasn't just glowing, it was changing. Faint images began to appear within the surface, like reflections on water. He leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. The images were scenes from the past, a bustling market from the Middle Ages, a battlefield, soldiers in armor clashing with swords, a family standing beside a Ford Model T, their faces filled with pride and wonder, a launch pad with a rocket poised to pierce the heavens. The images flickered and shifted, each one lasting only a moment before dissolving into the next. Jonathan's grip on the wheel tightened. He was looking at history, at time itself. The hum of the car's engine grew louder, and the road ahead began to ripple. The translucent surface twisted and buckled, and for a moment, Jonathan felt as though the car was driving through water. The sky around him darkened, and the swirling colors began to shift, coalescing into a shape. A figure. Jonathan slammed on the brakes, the Model T skidding to a stop. The figure stepped forward, its form shimmering like a mirage. It was human, or at least it appeared to be. It wore a long coat, the style reminiscent of the early 20th century, and its face was obscured by shadow. "Jonathan Reed," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. Jonathan's heart pounded. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, the shimmer around it growing brighter. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This place is not for you." Jonathan stared at the figure, his mind racing. "What is this place? What's happening?" "This is the stream," the figure replied. "The flow of time and possibility. You have crossed into it, but you are not meant to be here. The stream does not take kindly to intruders." Jonathan's hands clenched the wheel. "I didn't mean to come here. I was driving and there was a light." "The car brought you," the figure interrupted, its gaze shifting to the Model T. "It is not just a machine. It is a key." "A key?" Jonathan echoed, his voice trembling. The figure nodded. "The stream is vast, but it is not without structure. Certain objects are tied to it, anchors, gateways. Your car is one such anchor. It has brought you here because it carries a connection to the past, the present, and the future." Jonathan's mind reeled. The car, a key to time itself? It sounded impossible, but after everything he had seen, he couldn't dismiss it. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice cracking. The figure raised a hand, pointing to one of the branching paths ahead. "Drive," it said simply. "Follow the path. Find the heart of the stream." Jonathan hesitated. "And then what?" "You will know," the figure replied. Before Jonathan could ask another question, the figure dissolved into light, leaving him alone on the endless road. He sat there for a moment, his heart pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the throttle. The Model T surged forward, its engine roaring as it sped onto the path the figure had indicated. The road twisted and turned, winding through the swirling void. The images beneath the surface grew brighter, more vivid. Scenes of triumph, tragedy, and everything in between. Jonathan's eyes darted from one image to the next, each one pulling at his emotions in ways he couldn't explain. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A glowing sphere, suspended in the center of the stream. Tendrils of light stretched out from it, connecting to the countless roads that branched off into infinity. Jonathan's breath caught. This was it, the heart of the stream. But as he drew closer, the road beneath him began to crack. The translucent surface splintered, shards of light flying into the air. The Model T jolted violently, and the engine sputtered. The stream was fighting back. Jonathan gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the wheel as he fought to keep the car steady. He didn't know what awaited him at the heart of the stream, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn back now. The Model T rattled and shook as the translucent road beneath it fractured, cracks spreading like spiderwebs through the shimmering surface. Jonathan's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles white, as the car jolted violently. The glowing sphere at the center of the stream loomed ahead, its radiance pulsing in rhythm with the tremors shaking the road. The hum of the engine grew louder, deeper, almost as if the car itself were straining against the forces around it. Jonathan could feel the pressure building in the air, a weight pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. The path twisted and turned erratically, veering sharply to the left and then plunging downward at an impossible angle. Jonathan's stomach lurched, but he kept his focus on the glowing sphere, the one constant in the chaos around him. As he drew closer, he began to see the tendrils of light extending from the sphere more clearly. They weren't just connecting to the roads, they were holding the entire stream together. Each tendril pulsed with energy, their movements fluid and organic, like veins carrying the lifeblood of this strange, timeless place. But the cracks in the road weren't the only sign that something was wrong. The air itself shimmered and warped, and shapes began to emerge from the distortions. At first, they were faint, shadows barely visible against the kaleidoscope of light and color. But as Jonathan drove closer to the sphere, the shadows solidified into figures. They were humanoid but not human. Their bodies were composed of the same swirling light as the stream, and their faces were featureless, smooth planes that gave no hint of emotion. They stood motionless at the edges of the road, their heads turning in unison to watch Jonathan as he passed. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped onto the road, its movements unnaturally fluid. Jonathan swerved, narrowly avoiding it, the car skidding on the fractured surface. More figures followed, stepping onto the road ahead of him, their bodies glowing faintly in the dim light. They moved in unison, their heads tilting as if they were analyzing him. Jonathan's heart pounded. He had no idea what they were or what they wanted, but one thing was clear. They weren't here to help. He pressed the throttle, the Model T roaring as it surged forward. The figures didn't move out of the way. Instead, they raised their arms, beams of light shooting from their hands and striking the road in front of him. The surface exploded, shards of light flying into the air. Jonathan swerved again, the car bouncing violently as it raced over the uneven ground. The figures advanced, their movements slow but relentless. They weren't trying to stop him. They were trying to destroy the road itself. Jonathan's mind raced. If the road collapsed completely, he had no doubt he would fall into the void below. And he had no idea if the stream would let him survive. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the key to the Model T. It felt warm, almost alive, as if the car itself were urging him onward. With a deep breath, he pressed the throttle harder, the engine roaring louder than ever. As the car barreled toward the heart of the stream, the figures became more aggressive. They moved faster now, their glowing bodies darting across the road and striking it with bursts of energy. The cracks spread rapidly, and Jonathan could feel the surface shifting beneath the wheels. But he was close, so close. The sphere towered before him, its tendrils of light swirling and pulsing in a chaotic dance. The energy emanating from it was almost unbearable, the pressure in the air making his ears ring and his vision blur. The car jolted violently as one of the figures struck the road just behind him, the explosion sending shards of light flying into the air. Jonathan ducked instinctively, his heart racing as the car skidded and nearly spun out. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. As he approached the base of the sphere, a ramp of translucent light appeared, spiraling upward toward its center. Jonathan pressed the throttle one last time, the Model T climbing the ramp with surprising ease. The figures didn't follow. They stopped at the base of the ramp, their glowing faces tilting upward as they watched him ascend. Jonathan gritted his teeth, his hands shaking as he guided the car up the spiraling path. The tendrils of light surrounding the sphere grew brighter, their movements more frantic, as if the stream itself were reacting to his presence. When he reached the top, the ramp leveled out, bringing him to the very heart of the sphere. It was a massive, crystalline structure, its surface smooth and translucent. Pulses of light traveled through it, each one accompanied by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Jonathan climbed out of the car, his legs trembling as he approached the sphere. The energy radiating from it was overwhelming, making it difficult to think, to breathe. But as he stood before it, he noticed something strange. The surface of the sphere wasn't just glowing, it was reflecting. Jonathan stepped closer, his heart pounding as he saw his own face staring back at him. But it wasn't just his face. It was countless versions of himself, each one slightly different. Some wore different clothes, others had scars he didn't recognize, and some looked older, their eyes filled with a weariness he didn't yet understand. It wasn't a reflection. It was a window. This wasn't just the heart of the stream. It was the nexus of every version of him that had ever existed, every possibility, every choice he had ever made, or could have made. Jonathan reached out, his fingers brushing against the surface of the sphere. The moment he made contact, the world erupted into light. The moment Jonathan's fingers touched the crystalline surface, the light consumed him. It wasn't the blinding, overwhelming brightness he had experienced before. It was deeper, richer, as though he were being pulled into the very essence of the stream itself. For a moment, he felt weightless, suspended in a void where time had no meaning. The hum of the sphere vibrated through his body, resonating in his bones. His thoughts became disjointed, fragments of memories flashing through his mind. Childhood summers spent tinkering with his father's old cars, the first time he saw a Model T at the Henry Ford Museum, the countless nights he'd spent in his garage restoring his prized possession. And then, the void shifted. The swirling light solidified into images, scenes from his life, projected around him like holograms. But these weren't just memories. They were possibilities. To his left, he saw himself as a young man, walking away from the automotive scholarship he had been offered. Instead of becoming a historian, he had taken a different path, opening a chain of repair shops that grew into a nationwide brand. The name Reed Auto Repair flashed on a billboard in the background, and he watched as his older self smiled for a camera, flanked by employees. To his right, he saw a version of himself who had never left his small hometown. This Jonathan lived a quiet, contented life, raising a family and spending his days teaching high school history. The man in the image looked older but happier, his eyes free of the restless curiosity that had always driven Jonathan forward. Ahead of him, the images became stranger. He saw versions of himself in places he didn't recognize, walking on the surface of a barren moon, navigating the crowded streets of a futuristic city, standing in the middle of a battlefield dressed in armor. And then, the images fractured. They splintered into countless shards, each one reflecting a different possibility. Some were fleeting, flickering out of existence before he could fully comprehend them. Others lingered, vivid and painfully real. The stream wasn't just a nexus of time. It was a mirror of every choice, every consequence, every iteration of reality. Jonathan's chest tightened as he realized the truth. The sphere wasn't just the heart of the stream. It was its memory, its soul. It held everything that ever was, and everything that ever could be. But as he stood there, awestruck, a voice broke through the silence. "You see it now." Jonathan turned, his heart pounding. The figure from the road stood behind him, its form shimmering with the same ethereal light as the sphere. "What is this?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. "The stream," the figure said, stepping closer. "It is the flow of existence, the thread that ties every moment, every choice, every reality together. And you," the figure gestured to him, "are a part of it." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Why me? Why bring me here?" The figure's gaze shifted to the Model T, which still hummed softly behind them. "It was never about you, Jonathan. It was about the car." "The car?" Jonathan echoed, glancing back at the vehicle. "The Model T was more than a machine," the figure said. "It was a revolution. It reshaped the world, connected people, created possibilities. It became an anchor, not just in history, but in the stream itself. Every road it traveled, every person it touched, left a mark." Jonathan's mind reeled. "So, the car brought me here? Why? What does it want?" The figure tilted its head. "The stream doesn't want. It balances. The car is tied to the past, the present, and the future. When you restored it, you awakened that connection. It brought you here to make a choice." "A choice?" Jonathan asked, his stomach sinking. "What kind of choice?" The figure gestured to the sphere. "The stream is unraveling, Jonathan. The fractures you saw on the road, the figures trying to stop you, those are symptoms. Time is breaking. The weight of infinite possibilities has become too great." Jonathan's breath caught. "And you're saying I can fix it?" "Yes," the figure said, "but there is a cost." The sphere pulsed, and the images around them shifted again. Jonathan saw himself in his garage, working on the Model T. He saw himself laughing with friends, giving lectures about automotive history, living his quiet life in Dearborn. And then he saw what the figure meant. To repair the stream, to stabilize time, he would have to give up his place in it. His thread, his existence, would be absorbed into the stream, anchoring it and preventing further fractures. "You would become part of it," the figure said. "A guardian, a memory. You would exist in every moment, but never as yourself. Your life as you know it would end." Jonathan's knees felt weak. He stumbled back, his mind racing. "And if I don't?" The figure's light dimmed. "The stream will collapse. Time will fold in on itself, and every reality, every possibility, will cease to exist." Jonathan stared at the sphere, the weight of the choice crushing him. He thought of his life, the quiet comfort of his home, the satisfaction of his work. He thought of the car, the countless hours he had spent bringing it back to life. But he also thought of the roads he had seen, the endless possibilities, the lives that depended on the stream's stability. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "I'll do it," he said softly. The figure nodded, its form glowing brighter. Step forward. Jonathan approached the sphere, his heart pounding. He placed his hands on its surface, the light searing through him. The last thing he felt was peace. When Jonathan opened his eyes, he was everywhere. He was the hum of the Model T's engine, the crackle of its tires on gravel roads, the laughter of families it had carried. He was the stream itself, flowing through time, holding it together. And in Dearborn, Michigan, A restored Model T sat quietly in an empty garage, its brass radiator gleaming under the dim light. Jonathan Reed was gone, but the roads remained.